It wasn't a knock at the door. It was a notice taped to the glass, laminated, official, the kind of thing you don't ignore no matter how much you want to. I was 26 years old, standing in the hallway of the apartment my wife and I had rented for 3 years, holding a sheet of paper that told us we had 60 days to vacate. Harborview Property Group, a name I'd seen on glossy billboards around town but never thought twice about, had acquired our building, conversion to luxury condominiums. Current tenants, the letter explained in its careful corporate language, were not eligible for the new lease structure. My wife, Claire, read it over my shoulder. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she just went back to the kitchen and turned off the stove. We'd been in Portland, Oregon, for 4 years. I'd taken a project management job at a logistics company downtown. Claire was finishing her graduate degree in environmental science. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We had a life that fit together like something we'd built carefully, piece by piece. 60 days felt like a countdown to nothing. The rental market in Portland that spring was vicious. Every decent 2-bedroom within our budget had a waiting list. The ones that didn't have a waiting list had reasons you could smell from the parking lot. We drove to showings and sat in our car afterward without speaking. One place, a garden-level unit off Burnside, had a ceiling that bowed so low I could feel it above my head like a hand pressing down. Claire's mother offered her couch. My brother in Gresham offered his spare room. We thanked them both and kept looking. It was my wife who found it. She'd been scrolling listings late one night while I pretended to sleep, and she shook my arm and held the phone in front of my face. A property in rural Clatsop County, 40-some miles southwest of Portland. House and 2 acres. Asking price, $41,000. I sat up. That's not a typo. I've been staring at it for 10 minutes, she said. The listing photos were honest in the worst way. The house was a steep A-frame tucked at the edge of a Douglas fir forest, and it looked like it had been locked up and left alone for at least a decade. Moss on the roof, boards over 2 of the windows, a porch that tilted slightly toward the yard as if it had gotten tired of standing straight. The listing description said, "Sold as is, cash or conventional financing only. Property has been vacant. Buyer assumes all condition." That last line was doing a lot of work. We drove out on a Saturday morning in early March, when the sky was that particular Pacific Northwest white that isn't quite overcast and isn't quite clear. The county road turned to gravel about a mile before the property. The trees got taller. The cell signal dropped to 1 bar, then nothing. I parked on a muddy pull-off and we walked up to it. The smell hit first. That deep green rotten earth smell, wet wood, pine sap, something organic decomposing somewhere in the walls. The porch boards flexed under my feet. One of them snapped and I caught myself on the railing, which held barely. Claire stood on the bottom step and looked up at the roofline. "I think part of the shingles are just gone," she said. "I know. Like structurally gone, I know." We looked at each other, then we went inside. The interior was dim and smelled of mice and old insulation. The floors were original Douglas fir, stained and warped in places but somehow still there. The main room had a stone fireplace that went floor to ceiling, massive and handsome, the kind of thing you couldn't have built in that space without serious intention. I knocked on the stone with my knuckle. Solid. The kitchen was small and wrong. Wrong counter height, wrong everything. But the bones underneath it were fine. Upstairs, the sleeping loft had a cracked window and a section of ceiling that had given way to water damage. But the structural beams above it were intact. We stood in the middle of the main room for a while. "We could fix this," Claire said. I didn't say anything. "I'm not saying it would be easy," she said. "I'm saying it's fixable." She was right, and I knew she was right, but knowing something is fixable and wanting to fix it are 2 different things. What I was feeling in that moment wasn't enthusiasm. It was something quieter and harder, a kind of recognition. We had been pushed out of the life we'd built. This was what was left. We offered $38,000. The estate accepted $39,500. We used everything we had in savings and took a small personal loan from Claire's parents, who were generous and worried, and didn't say what they were thinking, which was probably that we had lost our minds. We closed in April, 43 days after the notice was taped to our door. The first night, we slept in sleeping bags on the floor of the loft because the air mattress had a slow leak. I lay on my back in the dark, listening to the forest outside. The creak of trees moving in the wind, something small running along the roofline, rain starting and stopping. Claire was asleep within 20 minutes. I was awake until 3. In the morning I drove to the hardware store in Astoria, 20 minutes away. A man named Ray was behind the counter, a retired contractor in his 60s who wore the same kind of flannel shirt every day. He asked where I was working. I told him. He knew the property. "You bought the Fenwick place," he said. I said I didn't know it had a name. "Old Hank Fenwick owned it. Bought it in the 50s, built the chimney himself. He was a peculiar man." Ray paused, kept to himself. "Passed a few years back. Estate took a while to settle. I bought caulk and roofing tape and 3 kinds of wood filler and drove back through the rain. We worked on it every weekend and every evening after our respective jobs. Mine remote now. Claire's field research had shifted south. The roof was the priority. We tarped it, then hired a local crew to replace the worst sections of shingles. Once we'd scraped together another $1,200. The porch came next, 1 board at a time, the old wood coming up in dark strips that smelled like the bottom of something. Claire was better with the circular saw than I was, and I didn't pretend otherwise. The walls inside were a patchwork of decisions made over decades by someone who didn't much care about consistency. Drywall over plank over something that might have been original lath. We stripped it back to the studs in the main room and found the place underneath. Clean lines, simple framing, good old growth timber that had dried for 70 years and was harder than anything you could buy now. It was the 4th week of real work when I found the discrepancy. I was measuring the main room for baseboards. I measured the exterior wall length on the south side, 38 feet. Then I measured the interior from the front wall to the fireplace, added fireplace depth, added the space on the other side of the fireplace into the bedroom, and came up short, by about 4.5 feet. I measured everything again. Still short, I went and got Claire. She did her own measurements, double-checking mine the way she always did without making it feel like she was checking me. "That's not right," she said. "I know." We looked at the fireplace. It was enormous, probably 4 feet deep by 6 feet wide, built of river stone laid in careful courses. The hearth extended 2 feet into the room. The chimney above it rose straight through the loft and out the roof. It was the most substantial thing in the house, more permanent looking than anything else we'd touched. "What if the space isn't inside the fireplace?" Claire said. I walked to the south exterior wall and went outside with a tape measure. I paced off the length of the house along the foundation. I came around to the area behind the fireplace and stopped. The foundation there didn't end where the house ended. It extended about 4 feet further than the exterior wall, wrapped in old concrete poured in a different era, slightly different color, slightly different texture. And there was a wooden door, not visible from the front approach, not visible from the gravel road, built flush against the rear exterior wall, with its frame filled in on 3 sides by old-growth cedar planks and what looked like insulation stuffed in behind them. I stood there in the wet grass looking at it for a full minute before I called Claire. The door was padlocked. The padlock was old, surface rusted but heavy. I went to the toolbox in my truck and came back with a hacksaw, a hammer. Claire held the flashlight. It took longer than I expected to cut through the shank. When the door swung open, cool air came out. Not the damp rot smell of the rest of the house. Something drier and older, like a stone cellar. I went in first. The space was maybe 12 feet square, dug down about 3 feet below grade so the ceiling was low. 6 feet, maybe 6'2". The walls were poured concrete on 3 sides and the back of the fireplace on the 4th. Someone had put up wooden shelving on 2 of the walls, and the shelves were full. Metal lockboxes, the kind with keyed lids, glass canning jars with dark contents, a steel filing cabinet, 2 drawers, a metal trunk, olive drab, the kind sold as army surplus for decades, and on the lowest shelf, in an old gallon coffee can with a plastic lid, a folded piece of paper and two bundles of bills wrapped in rubber bands. Claire picked up the coffee can. I opened the filing cabinet. The top drawer held a thick stack of folders in hanging files, the tabs labeled in ballpoint pen in a small, cramped hand. The labels were dates and names, names of companies, names of people, and one name that appeared on almost every folder tab, sometimes as the sender, sometimes as the recipient, Coastal Summit Holdings. I pulled a folder at random. Inside were carbon copies of financial statements, ledger pages, what looked like wire transfer records. The originals were old enough that they'd been typed on a typewriter, the copies faint but legible. The amounts were not small. 6 figures, 7 figures, moving between entities I'd never heard of through accounts at institutions that no longer existed. I didn't understand what I was looking at, not in that moment, but I knew enough to know it was significant. Claire had opened the coffee can. Inside the folded paper were the bills, 2 bundles of 20s, banded with paper sleeves from a bank that had been absorbed by a larger bank sometime in the 90s, based on the logo. Maybe $3,000 total, and the folded page, which was a handwritten letter, unsigned, addressed to no one. She read it out loud while I held the flashlight. The letter was from Hank Fenwick. It wasn't addressed to the estate or to an heir. It was addressed, in a way, to whoever found this room. He wrote that he had worked for Coastal Summit Holdings starting in 1979 as a bookkeeper in their Portland regional office. He wrote that he had watched, over the course of 6 years, as the company moved money through a series of shell entities. Construction companies that never built anything, timber leases for land that didn't exist, real estate transactions where the properties changed hands 3 times in a year to inflate valuations. He wrote that he had made copies of what he could without getting caught, and that he had kept them here because he was afraid and because he didn't know who to trust. He wrote that he had tried once to bring the records to a lawyer. The lawyer had told him that without corroboration the documents might be challenged as forgeries. He had tried once to contact the FBI field office in Portland. He had gotten a form letter in response. He had carried it alone, he wrote, for over 30 years. He was sorry. He thought somebody should know. I sat down on the concrete floor of that room and stayed there for a long time. The filing cabinet had more than just financial records. The bottom drawer held a set of original ledgers, the real ones, handwritten in columns, with the actual entity names and the actual figures before they were laundered through the shell structure. They were meticulous, obsessive, the work of a man who understood that his only power was precision. Coastal Summit Holdings, it turned out, was not a historical curiosity. It still existed. I found that out the following week when I started researching the name. The company had rebranded twice, acquired by a larger regional real estate group in the early 90s, then again in 2004 by a private equity firm out of Seattle. The firm was called Ridgeline Capital Partners. They had a sleek website and a portfolio page listing their assets under management. One of their current holdings was a property management division operating across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. One of their managed properties had been our apartment building in Portland. I read that sentence on my laptop screen, sitting at our kitchen table, the table we'd hauled up from the truck and set in the middle of the gutted main room, and I didn't move for a while. Harborview Property Group was a subsidiary of Ridgeline Capital Partners, which was the successor entity to the company that Hank Fenwick had spent 6 years watching launder money through construction shells and fictional timber leases in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The people who had evicted us with a laminated notice and 60 days to leave were the same people the old man in this house had been watching for 30 years. And then he had died, and the estate had sat, and the house had been listed, and we had been pushed out of every other option we had, and we had bought it. I took Claire's hand and told her what I'd found. She sat down across from me. "You're sure?" she said. "The entity history is public record. I've traced it through 3 acquisition documents." She looked at the filing cabinet sitting in the corner of our kitchen, which we'd carried up from the room below. Hank tried for 30 years, she said. He didn't have the internet, I said. He didn't know how to reach the right people. Do we? I thought about that. We talked about it for 2 nights. We weren't lawyers. We weren't journalists. We were a 26-year-old project manager and a graduate student in environmental science sitting in a half-renovated A-frame with no cell service and a filing cabinet full of documents that were 40 years old. What we had was real, but real and useful are different things. What we needed was someone who could tell the difference. I reached out to a professor in Claire's department who had done work on environmental litigation and knew the landscape of public interest law in Oregon. She listened to a careful, abbreviated version of what we had. She gave us a name. The attorney was based in Portland, a partner at a small firm that specialized in financial fraud cases. Her name was Ms. Voss. She had a calm, unhurried way of speaking that made the hair on my arms stand up slightly, because I recognized it as the voice of someone who had been in rooms where things were worse than this. We drove to Portland with the documents, originals, organized into the folders Hank had made, plus the ledger books in a banker's box, and sat across from her at a conference table while she read. She read for a long time without saying anything. When she finally looked up, she said, "Where did these come from?" I told her. She listened without interrupting. She said, "These ledgers would establish a pattern of fraud that predates the incorporation of Ridgeline Capital Partners. If the successor liability can be established, and I believe it can, based on the acquisition documentation, then these records are relevant to the current entity. What does that mean in practical terms?" Claire asked. "It means," Ms. Voss said, "that we have standing to pursue this." The next 6 months were not cinematic. They were long and procedural and exhausting. There were document reviews and affidavits, and phone calls we weren't allowed to be part of. There was a period of about 3 weeks in late summer when we heard nothing, and I stayed up too late every night, convincing myself it had fallen apart. There was a morning when Ms. Voss called and said, in that careful voice, that Ridgeline's legal team had requested a meeting, which she read as a signal. We asked what kind of signal. She said the kind that means they know what they're holding. The investigation that followed brought in the Oregon Department of Justice and a federal financial crimes unit. The scope of what Hank Fenwick had documented turned out to be substantially larger than 40 years of compounding had made it look from the outside. The original fraud involved the systematic inflation of timber and real estate assets used as collateral for loans that were never intended to be repaid. The shell structure had moved an estimated $380 million through Oregon's banking system over a 6-year period. The institutional damage had been absorbed by smaller regional banks, several of which had failed in the early 80s in ways that had always been attributed to market conditions. Ridgeline Capital Partners settled with the state of Oregon for $112 million. Their property management division was dissolved as part of the agreement. 3 executives were referred for criminal prosecution. Harborview Property Group ceased operations on a Thursday in November. Every tenant in every building they managed received a notice. Not a laminated eviction sheet, but a formal letter from the Oregon AG's office explaining the dissolution, with resources attached and assurances that lease protections would remain in force through a court-appointed receiver. I read about it online, in our kitchen, at the table we'd carried in off the truck. The cabin was finished by then. Not luxury. We hadn't had the money for luxury and probably wouldn't have wanted it anyway. But finished. The floors were refinished and warm. The fireplace worked. The roof held through 2 weeks of November rain without a single drip. We'd built a proper kitchen with tile Claire had found at a salvage yard in Tillamook and a reading area in the loft with a window that looked out over the firs toward the Coast Range. It was quiet at night in a way that took months to get used to. The only sounds were the trees and whatever was moving through them. We kept the room below. It was clean now, swept out and lit by a proper fixture. The filing cabinet was gone, turned over to Ms. Voss and eventually to the state. The shelves were empty. The metal trunk had held more of Hank's personal papers, which we'd read carefully and then surrendered to the estate's attorney, who had eventually located a surviving niece in Bend who hadn't known the property still existed. The niece called us. She was 60-something, named Darla, and she cried on the phone when I told her what her uncle had tried to do. She said she'd always thought he was strange and reclusive. She said she'd never understood why he stayed in that house so long. I told her I thought I understood. He had stayed because the evidence was there. He had stayed because walking away would have meant leaving the only proof he'd ever had. He had kept it because some part of him believed that eventually someone would find it who knew what to do. We had the room fitted out as a small storage space. Shelving for tools, a chest freezer, the extra firewood that didn't fit in the shed. Useful things, ordinary things. Some evenings I go down there just to stand in it for a moment. The concrete walls, the low ceiling, the faint smell of stone that no amount of cleaning has entirely removed. I think about the old man who built this house with his own hands and then spent 30 years watching through its windows and not knowing how to be heard. We weren't supposed to be here. We were pushed out of every other option. We bought this place because it was the last thing left. But I think about that sometimes. How being left with no other choice turned out to be the exact thing we needed. How the smallest door, the one behind the fireplace, in the house at the end of a gravel road, led somewhere the people who tried to take everything from us never thought to look. The rotting wood is gone. The roof holds. And what Hank Fenwick kept in the dark for 30 years finally found its way into the light.